Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the new album from Suicidal Tendencies, still psychopunk after all these years. This is the newest album from this crossover thrash group, and if you're curious, I recently did cover, or talk about rather, this group's newest EP that they put out earlier this year, the Get Your Fight On EP that was dropped back in March, I believe. I didn't get a chance to really talk about it until a catch-up review I did a couple weeks ago or so, which is going to be linked in the description down below. And the only reason I bring this up, really, not just because you may be interested in checking out my thoughts on another project from this group, but rather because I feel like that EP and this album go hand in hand to some extent. Because you see, this newest album here from Suicidal Tendencies is kind of complicated in some regards. It's part cover album, part remake, I guess you could say, considering that this is actually, the majority of the songs on this project are actually re-recorded songs from the frontman of Suicidal Tendencies, a side project called Cyco. It was kind of a solo-ish project that he had going on, and it's a remake of sorts of his album Lost My Brain Once Again that was released back in the 90s. And the track list is, for that album compared to this one, is almost identical in terms of what songs are on it. The track order is switched, and there are some songs that don't appear on this version that appear on the original. However, one of those tracks appears on the EP I was mentioning before earlier this year, along with one of the tracks from this album actually also appears on that EP as well. And there's also a track on this album that isn't technically on that original album, but was kind of remade in some regard into one of the ones that's present on this album here, the track Sippin' on the Insanity in particular. And I wasn't familiar with this original album, this older album, when I came into this new album here. Fortunately, I happened to look into this album a bit and find out that it was in fact this sort of remake cover thing. So I did listen to some of the tracks from the older album, not the entire thing, but I did check out some of them just to get a general feel for that project and to see how the tracks on this one compared, really. And I will touch on that in a bit more detail later on, but essentially this album is kind of an odd project in the regard that it's, both sort of a cover album because, they're covering songs from a different project, but it's also in many ways kind of a remake considering either there's shared members between both this album and the original one that it's remaking. But it's also like a different track order and all that. It's a little bit strange. Now, despite all this sort of complicated things I just needed to explain now before getting into my actual, the meat of my review, my actual thoughts on this project, despite there being a lot to say in that regard, there's really not all that much for me to say about this album when it comes down to the actual music itself. This is a pretty uninteresting project, in my opinion. Mostly because I don't really feel like it does all that much super new compared to the original material that was on that older album. And once again, I didn't listen to it in full. I did hear the majority of the tracks from it in some regard. But listening to that thing, it's also the genre is pretty much the same as this new album here. It's not like this side project and that older album was like just some completely different genre, and that now Suicidal Tendencies wanted to cover it in their own styling because there were shared members, and that would have maybe been an interesting idea had that original project been like a completely different genre or something like that. That could have been cool, but it's not really. It's pretty similar to the sound of this new album here, so they just kind of sound like updated versions of the older songs to some extent, and there are some changes here and there, like I said before, and I'm sure the more hardcore fans who know the original album maybe will be able to pick up on those things. But it just, at least to me, I'm a fan of Suicidal Tendencies. I wouldn't consider myself a hardcore fan. I'm not exactly a casual fan either. I'd say I'm somewhere in between, just a general fan, I guess. But for me at least, as someone who would consider myself a general fan of this group, this album really did not do much for me because it's just pretty average through and through. All the performances on this project are fine, I would say. In fact, at times they can manage to be pretty good, particularly the drums. I really like the drums on this project, probably in part because Dave Lombardo is one of my favorite drummers, and he's doing the drums here on this project. I feel like the drums were easily one of the strongest points here. And the rest of the band is doing a pretty good job as well. There's not really any points on the album that I can kind of point out and be like, that's kind of a weak point right there, just on its own, really. Because, you know, at worst, it just manages to be, like, solid, but not, like, in a way that's, you know, good necessarily, just in a way that's, like, you know, passable, I guess. The songs across this thing certainly have a good amount of energy to them. They certainly have that thrashy vibe that you would expect from Suicidal Tendencies. However, they're not super interesting in their own right either. There's not really much about these tracks that really pop out to me and make me want to return to them for more repeated listens or anything quite like that. I feel very similar to this project as I did to that EP I was talking about before they dropped earlier this year. I just felt like a lot of the tracks on that thing were just kind of uninteresting overall, and the same goes for this album. It's just a very middle of the road crossover thrash album, which just kind of sees the band retreading ground that they've kind of done before, though technically not, because that older album wasn't technically a Suicidal Tendencies album. It's kind of odd, but you know, I feel like the explaining what, you know, differences this album has to the original is probably more interesting than anything actually on this album itself. And I know the group has done things like this before in the past, you know, remaking older material and things of that sort. It hasn't interested me in the past, and it really isn't interesting me now either. Like I said, had they come into this thing and really done something different with these tracks, maybe played them in a different style, or maybe had they played in a different style originally from what Suicidal Tendencies typically does, and had they done that here on this project, done it in their more typical style, that could have been interesting. But, you know, the way this project goes, they're just playing these songs for the most part in pretty much the same style that they were being done before. Like I said, there are some changes, but they're not, you know, big enough to really warrant the existence of this album, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Listening to this thing is, you know, it's okay, I guess. It didn't really bother me to listen to this thing. There are moments on it that I think are solid overall. The performances on it are fine throughout. But there's nothing about the album that makes me want to return to it for repeated listens or anything like that. It's just a pretty boring listen through and through, especially after you know the fact that there is, you know, an older album that this one is pretty much just based off of. I'm guessing if you haven't heard that one and you come into this thing, you might like it a bit more, but even then I don't think it's that impressive of a project. It's still just pretty average crossover thrash, and I think the band has many other projects that are much more interesting and exciting and worth your time pretty much. So yeah, I just felt like this is an average project overall. I know there wasn't all that much for me to say about it, but like I said, there's very few moments on this thing that really stood out to me. There are some tracks on here that I did think were maybe a bit better than others, like Sippin' from the Insanity, as well as the opening track, I Love Destruction, that I thought was also pretty enjoyable. But even these tracks aren't that much better than the rest of the cuts on this thing. It's all just pretty middle of the road. But yeah, that is just my own personal opinion. If you happen to have a different one, if you happen to love this thing, you happen to hate this thing, it's perfectly okay. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, all that type of stuff. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure you subscribe. And if you want to see my thoughts on that Suicidal Tendencies EP that dropped earlier this year, like I said, the link to that video is going to be in the description down below and up on screen here at the end of the video. Though, like I mentioned before, it's a catch-up review video, so it's shared with some other projects that I was reviewing in there. But I believe it was the first one I reviewed in the video, so you won't have to jump around to anywhere if you want to hear my thoughts on that project. But yeah, this was just an okay project, I guess. If you're a hardcore Suicidal Tendencies fan, you'll probably check it out. You probably already have checked it out, but aside from that, I wouldn't recommend it. But yeah, thanks for watching, guys, and stay golden.